I was halfway through shoveling hay when I heard it, the unmistakable screech. Not just any screech, but the kind of dramatic, glass-shattering wail that could only mean one thing. Margaret had arrived. "You have exactly 5 seconds to explain why this eyesore is still here," she shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my old barn. The morning sun glinted off her oversized sunglasses, her face scrunched in righteous indignation. She stood there in her designer athleisure, looking as out of place on my farm as a rooster at a dog show. I wiped my brow, trying to keep my cool. "Because it's my barn, on my land, Margaret." She let out an exaggerated gasp, clutching her chest as if I had insulted her great-grandmother's honor. "Excuse me?" I was assured that something would be done about this. "The Homeowners Association has declared it a neighborhood disgrace." I bit my tongue to keep from laughing. My barn had been here for decades, long before her overpriced McMansion popped up on the next hill. But Margaret wasn't the type to let reality interfere with her personal narrative. She stomped forward, practically foaming at the mouth. "I have a vision for this community," she declared, waving her arms dramatically. "We need a proper space for events, wine tastings, social gatherings, maybe even a yoga retreat with goats. You should be grateful I'm even considering using this dump for something meaningful." I raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me you want my barn for goat yoga?" Her expression soured. "Not your goats, obviously. I'll bring in my own fancy, trained ones. Yours are uncivilized." At that moment, my prize goat, Buttercup, chose to trot up and bleat aggressively in her direction. Margaret yelped and jumped back, nearly tripping over her own wedge sneakers. Buttercup, sensing weakness, strutted closer, clearly enjoying the show. "Get that thing away from me," Margaret screeched, flailing as though she'd been set upon by a pack of wolves. I crossed my arms, watching the scene unfold. "Buttercup seems to like you." "Well, I don't like her, or this barn, or any of this farm nonsense," she scowled, straightening herself out and dramatically flipping her hair. "Which is why it needs to go. But since I'm feeling generous, I'll take it off your hands." I blinked. "You're offering to buy my barn?" Her lips curled into a victorious smirk. "Oh, not buy. I figured we could work something out, neighbor to neighbor. You let me have the barn, I clean it up, and we turn it into a respectable venue for HOA-approved events. A community asset instead of this decrepit embarrassment sitting in plain view of my backyard." I stared at her. "So, you want me to just give you my barn?" "Exactly," she chirped, as if it were the most obvious and reasonable request in the world. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. "Margaret, that barn is mine. It's been in my family for generations. I'm not handing it over so you can turn it into some kind of wine bar for suburban socialites." Her face darkened. "You are being unbelievably selfish," she snapped. "This is about the greater good of the neighborhood. Do you even understand how property values work? Your farm is a blight on the area." I glanced around at my acres of open land, the rolling hills, the lush pastures where my animals roamed freely. Then I looked at Margaret, fuming like an angry chihuahua in a Gucci tracksuit. "No," I said finally. "I think you're just mad you have to look at something that doesn't fit your aesthetic." Margaret's nostrils flared. "Fine," she seethed. "If you won't do the right thing, I'll make you. You have no idea who you're dealing with." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, muttering about legal action and zoning violations. I watched her go, shaking my head. That's when an idea hit me. Margaret wanted my barn? Fine. I'd give her my barn, but not in the way she expected. Later that evening, I sat down with a cup of coffee and drafted the perfect agreement. I called it the new lease on the barn, a document that, on the surface, seemed like a standard lease transfer. In reality, it was a legal trap wrapped in a neat little bow. If Margaret signed it, she would become solely responsible for all upkeep, maintenance, and care of everything inside the barn. And by everything, I meant everything, my animals included. The moment she took ownership, she'd be legally obligated to feed, house, and care for the goats, chickens, and, of course, my prized donkey, Mr. Whiskers. She'd also be on the hook for any damage caused by the animals to her own property. I could barely contain my grin as I printed out the papers. The next morning, Margaret was back, looking smug as ever. "Have you come to your senses?" she asked, tapping her foot impatiently. I put on my best gracious neighbor expression. "Actually, I have. I realized you're right. This barn is wasted on me. And since you're so passionate about making it useful, I'd be happy to transfer it over to you. Her eyes lit up. Finally, someone reasonable. I handed her the papers. Just sign here, and it's all yours. Margaret didn't even glance at the fine print. She just snatched the pen and scribbled her name, probably thinking she'd won some great victory. Pleasure doing business with you, I said, shaking her hand. Margaret beamed. Oh, this is going to be wonderful. I already have a decorator lined up, and we'll be removing all this disgusting farm junk. About that, I interrupted. You'll probably want to read Section 3. She frowned. Section what? I patted the stack of papers. Section 3. The part where you officially assume responsibility for all barn residents. Margaret's smile faltered. Barn residents? Buttercup chose that moment to leap onto a wooden crate, letting out an earth-shattering bleat. I grinned. Congratulations, Margaret. You're the proud new owner of a fully operational farm animal shelter. For the first time in her life, Margaret was speechless. I could practically see the gears in her head grinding as she flipped through the contract, her expression twisting from confusion to horror. You can't be serious, she finally shrieked. I folded my arms. Oh, I'm very serious. And with that, the chaos officially began. The moment reality hit, Margaret was nothing short of spectacular. She had walked onto my property the next morning with the confidence of a queen, fully expecting to start transforming the barn into her personal event venue. But within seconds, her illusion crumbled like a stale cracker under a donkey's hoof. She stood frozen at the entrance, eyes darting wildly across the chaos inside. The barn was alive, goats climbed on top of wooden barrels, chickens flapped noisily from their nests, and Mr. Whiskers, my prized donkey, stared her down like a judge about to hand out a life sentence. The smell of hay, dust, and fresh manure hit her full force, and I watched as her nostrils flared in sheer disgust. What is this? She hissed, her voice trembling between rage and disbelief. I leaned casually against a wooden post, enjoying every second. Your new property, I reminded her. Congratulations, Margaret. You're now responsible for all of this. Her lips quivered as she flipped frantically through the contract she had signed the day before. Her hands shook as she squinted at the legal jargon, hoping to find some loophole, some escape. But she had signed without reading, and now she was stuck. You tricked me, she shrieked, throwing the papers to the ground. Actually, I corrected, you tricked yourself. You wanted the barn, now you've got it. Animals and all. Before she could launch into another tirade, Buttercup, my mischievous goat, seized the opportunity. With a sudden leap, he lashed onto the hem of Margaret's designer cardigan, yanking it forcefully. Margaret screamed, flailing her arms as she tried to shake him off, but Buttercup was persistent, chewing aggressively on the expensive fabric as Margaret spun in circles. Get it off me, she wailed, stumbling backward into a pile of hay. I considered helping, but honestly, I was enjoying the show far too much. Margaret scrambled to her feet, panting and disheveled, her pristine outfit now covered in hay and goat slobber. This is unacceptable, she spat. I'm calling the HOA. They will shut this whole thing down. I shrugged. Go ahead. But just a heads up, technically, you now own an active barn full of farm animals. That makes your property agricultural land. And from what I understand, that's a violation of your HOA rules. Margaret's face drained of color as the weight of my words sank in. You're lying, she whispered. Am I? I gestured toward her freshly chewed cardigan. Because from where I'm standing, you look like a farm owner to me. Margaret pulled out her phone with shaking hands and stormed off, presumably to scream at someone from the HOA. I let her go. She would figure it out soon enough. By mid-afternoon, I heard her return. Her expensive heels clicked angrily against the gravel as she stomped toward me. The wild look in her eyes told me she had, in fact, spoken to the HOA, and the conversation had not gone in her favor. They fined me, she screamed, for unauthorized livestock. Well, I said, scratching my chin, maybe you should have read the contract. You knew this would happen, she accused, pointing a trembling finger at me. Of course I did, I admitted with a smile. Margaret let out a furious growl, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Fine, she snapped. You win. I don't want the stupid barn. Take it back. I crossed my arms. Oh, it's not that simple. See, there's a clause in the contract. You can only transfer ownership back if you successfully host an HOA-approved farm event using the barn. Margaret's jaw dropped. That's ridiculous. Not really, I said. It's a community space now. You wanted a venue for the neighborhood, remember? You just have to use it. Shouldn't be a problem for someone with your creative vision. Margaret's expression was something between horror and despair. The next day, the real fun began. Margaret, now legally obligated to care for the barn, attempted to interact with the animals. It did not go well. Her first task was feeding the goats. She marched into the barn with a bag of grain, muttering angrily under her breath. The moment she opened the bag, disaster struck. The goats, recognizing the scent of food, launched themselves at her like a stampede. Margaret let out a blood-curdling scream as Buttercup led the charge, knocking the bag out of her hands and sending grain flying everywhere. As she scrambled to escape, her foot slipped on a stray piece of hay, and she went down like a fallen tree. The goats wasted no time swarming her as she lay sprawled in the dirt. "Help me, you idiot!" she shrieked, flailing as Buttercup climbed onto her stomach. I took a sip of my iced tea, leaning against the fence. "You're doing great," I called. She let out a strangled cry of frustration as a particularly aggressive chicken pecked at her shoelace. Margaret staggered to her feet, hair in disarray, outfit completely ruined. "I hate you," she spat, her eyes burning with rage. "And yet," I said, "you're still legally required to take care of the barn." That evening, a storm rolled in. The wind howled, rain drummed against the roof, and lightning lit up the sky. The animals were restless, bleating and squawking in fear. Normally, I would handle this situation myself, but tonight, it was Margaret's responsibility. I watched from my porch as she ran outside, desperately trying to keep the barn doors from blowing open. She fought against the wind, slipping in the mud, screaming in frustration. And then it happened. In her panic, she forgot to secure the main latch. The wind yanked the door open, and the animals, already on edge, saw their chance. The goats bolted first, disappearing into the night. The chickens followed suit, flapping wildly in all directions. Then came Mr. Whiskers, with the force of a wrecking ball. He charged out of the barn, straight toward Margaret's backyard. Margaret's face contorted in sheer horror as she watched him gallop toward her meticulously maintained lawn. "No," she wailed, sprinting after him. By the time I reached the scene, chaos had fully erupted. The goats had climbed onto her patio furniture, gleefully chewing on her expensive outdoor cushions. The chickens had scattered across the yard, leaving little presents on her pristine white deck. And Mr. Whiskers? He stood triumphantly in the middle of her perfectly manicured flower bed, snorting in satisfaction as he stomped his hooves deep into the soil. Margaret fell to her knees, her eyes wide in horror. "This is a nightmare," she whispered. I patted her on the shoulder. "Welcome to farm life, Margaret." She let out a guttural scream that could have shattered glass. It was a thing of beauty. Margaret stood in the middle of her wrecked backyard, gasping like a woman who had just discovered she'd lost a winning lottery ticket. Her once pristine patio was now a wasteland of chewed cushions, trampled flower beds, and a very content Mr. Whiskers standing in the wreckage of what had been an expensive outdoor dining set. The goats had made themselves at home on her lounge chairs, happily munching away at the remains of her decorative shrubbery. She turned to me slowly, her face an alarming shade of red. "Fix this. Now." I took a long, deliberate sip of my lemonade and sighed. "Not my barn anymore, remember? You're in charge of everything now, including the cleanup." Margaret's hands clenched into fists, her body trembling. "This is inhumane. This is illegal. This is..." She suddenly gasped and snapped her fingers. "I'll sue you." I shrugged. "For what? You signed a legally binding contract. If you take this to court, the judge is just going to ask why you didn't read it before signing. And honestly, I'd love to see how you explain this to a lawyer without sounding like a complete fool." Her mouth opened and closed like a malfunctioning puppet. She turned sharply and yanked out her phone, jabbing at the screen. "I'm calling my lawyer right now. He's going to tear you apart in court." I waited patiently as she put the call on speaker. A smooth, professional voice answered. "Margaret, what now?" "It's an emergency," she shrieked. This man tricked me into taking over a farm, and now my entire backyard is destroyed. I need you to." "No," the voice cut in. Margaret froze. "What do you mean, no?" I mean, no, the lawyer repeated, sighing deeply. Margaret, this is the third time this month you've called me over some ridiculous neighborhood dispute. I still haven't recovered from the illegal garden gnome case you tried to push. I am not going to court over you signing something without reading it. Margaret's jaw fell open. But I pay you. Not enough, the lawyer replied. Have a great day, Margaret. The call disconnected. Margaret stood there, shaking with suppressed rage. I gave her a sympathetic nod. Tough break. She spun around, her eyes wild. Fine. I'll figure out another way. I just need to get rid of this barn. I grinned. About that. You still need to host that HOA event before you can transfer ownership back to me. Her expression flickered between disbelief and despair. You cannot be serious. Oh, I am, I assured her. And I heard the HOA president is really looking forward to it. Something about bringing the community together through shared experiences. Margaret let out a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a growl. She looked at the mess around her, the goats, the chickens, the grumpy-looking donkey who had now claimed her patio as his personal resting place. She took a deep breath and straightened her spine, her expression suddenly steely. Fine, she said, her voice tight. I'll host your stupid event. But when it's over, I never want to see your face again. I gave her a cheerful thumbs up. Looking forward to it. The day of the HOA event arrived, and I had never been more excited for anything in my life. Margaret, on the other hand, looked like a woman walking to her own execution. She had begrudgingly embraced the theme, though not without complaint. The entire barn had been decorated with rustic charm, bales of hay arranged into seating areas, fairy lights strung across the wooden beams, and a long buffet table filled with farm-style appetizers. Unfortunately for Margaret, the farm experience also meant fully interacting with the animals. The HOA members arrived, most of them delighted by the idea of a community barn gathering. Margaret forced a smile as she greeted them, but it was clear she was barely holding it together. Her carefully maintained composure cracked completely when Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman with a love for all things quirky, clapped her hands together and exclaimed, "Oh, what a wonderful idea. I can't wait to milk a cow." Margaret's eyes darted toward me in horror. "What cow?" she whispered, her voice dangerously low. I grinned. "Oh, right. I forgot to mention, one of my neighbors was kind enough to bring over Bessie for an interactive experience." As if on cue, a large, placid-looking cow was led into the barn, blinking lazily at the gathering crowd. Margaret swayed slightly, like she might faint. The event quickly spiraled into comedic chaos. The goats refused to stay put, leading a group of horrified suburbanites on a wild chase around the property. Mr. Whiskers had taken a liking to Margaret's decorative flower barrels and was currently kicking them over one by one. The children, however, were having the time of their lives, shrieking with laughter as they attempted, and failed, to catch Buttercup, who was darting between guests like a tiny, mischievous hurricane. Margaret was sweating profusely, her forced smile twitching as she tried to keep control of the situation. But it was a losing battle. The final straw came when Mrs. Henderson actually attempted to milk Bessie and ended up knocking over an entire pail of water in the process, sending a flood of muddy water straight into Margaret's expensive shoes. Margaret let out a high-pitched scream and bolted toward me, her hair frizzing, her dress covered in hay and farm grime. "I did it," she shrieked. "I hosted the event. Take your barn back. I'm done." I tapped my chin thoughtfully. "I don't know. You really brought the community together. Maybe you should keep it." Her entire body shook. "I will pay you to take it back." I pretended to consider it. Tempting. But actually, I have a better deal." She hesitated, wary. "What is it?" I grinned. "You personally take care of Mr. Whiskers for 1 full week. Then we call it even." Margaret let out a strangled noise that might have been a scream or a sob. 1 week. 1 week, I confirmed. She turned and looked at Mr. Whiskers, who was currently chewing on what remained of her designer handbag. Margaret inhaled deeply through her nose. "Fine," she whispered, sounding utterly defeated. And so, for the next 7 days, Margaret was stuck with Mr. Whiskers. He made sure to make her life as difficult as possible, chewing her mail, kicking over her trash cans, and, on one memorable occasion, somehow locking himself inside her house. When the week was over, she practically threw the contract at me, looking like she had aged 10 years. "We're done," she muttered. I shook her hand. Pleasure doing business with you. She stormed off without another word. A few days later, I was back on my porch, sipping lemonade and watching Margaret argue with an HOA official about how to make her yard goat-proof. Mr. Whiskers let out a triumphant hee-haw. Justice had been served.